In this video today, I'm going to explain to you why most retirees with £1 million invested will die with 5 million, or actually sometimes even more, and why that's something not to actually be proud of. I've spent the last 2 decades helping hundreds of retirees with their retirement plans, and I've seen the same painful pattern over and over again. People save their entire lives and then never actually give themselves permission to spend in retirement. So in this video, I'm going to tell you why saving too much in retirement is actually the worst thing you could do, why you actually need to spend more money when you stop working, and a clever way how I help people track what they spend in retirement so they never have that fear of running out of money. Now, what if the real retirement crisis is not running out of money, it's actually just not spending enough? You worked and saved for decades, yet many retirees fail to use what they've actually saved. Now let me show you what's really happening behind the scenes when you're retiring. While retirees obsess over actually running out of money, what I actually see is that actually retirees are just not tapping into spending their money properly. They put off that trip for the future, they don't book that holiday, they postpone adventures with friends, all under the guise of just being safe. And what's worse, the safety part is not actually driven by your best interests, but actually by the financial incentives to not spend so much and keep saving. Now let's take a couple I've spoken to in their 60s. Their mortgage was fully paid off. All their living expenses were going to be comfortably covered by their state pensions when they kicked in, and by a small final salary pension they had as well. Yet I sat with them and asked them what their dream trips were, and one of them was a Lions trip and a big European cruise. But they didn't want to go ahead with those. They were scared that the 800,000 that they had invested in other investments and pensions just wasn't there to be used for that. They felt it was just too risky to use that money, and therefore the joy that they wanted was just put to one side. Now that to me is a massive shame. But we changed that narrative with making sure that they had a proper plan, and that cash flow forecasting was used to make them realize that they could do the things they dreamed of. Now, what we've got to be mindful of, the data actually supports this behavior. If you look at data provided by the Institute of Fiscal Studies, it shows that on average, retirees' spending remains flat in retirement and doesn't actually go up, and they don't spend on the things they want to. And we also know that from experience that once you hit that 80, 85 mark, spending actually starts to go backwards. So we should really be looking to spend in the early years, but we're scared to do so. And that knock-on effect as the most retirees, as they get older, stop spending their wealth, and that's why potentially they die with far more than they actually retired with. Wealth accumulation is actually the consumption gap in action. Now, if you wanted to have your own personal financial plan and have your income tested in retirement using cash flow forecasting, click on the link below and book a call in with me, and we can discuss this in far more detail. Now, there is a psychology around underspending. Now, after a long lifetime of saving and investing for the future, spending can actually just feel wrong, almost like you're breaking the rule that you've had for years whilst you were building this pot up. You've likely been praised by others for your frugality or your ability to save and be quite good with money as time goes on. But that identity just becomes you in retirement, and you become really risk averse, and you've made all these great savings for the future, but then fail to actually spend the money and enjoy what you've done. And let's throw in the negative events world service, which we get from the news, which says inflation is high, markets are dropping, cost of living's gone through the roof. And I can't blame you for thinking, shouldn't be spending my money. We all see the headlines. Will my pension last? Will I outlast my pension? All these scary tactics that are in the media, they just inflame this fear of spending too much in retirement. And we flip back into preservation mode, and I can't spend because I'm going to run out. I had a client once say to me, look, I don't want to run out of money, so therefore I'm just not going to start spending. I'm going to keep working. They actually admitted they'd rather live on less and have less nice things and enjoy less holidays, just so they could be safe in the fact that they're not going to run out of money. Now that for me was quite sad. But here's the truth. If we looked at a balanced portfolio and a inflation-linked withdrawal of 4% a year, it actually does show that most retirees will retire with more in their pension pot than they finished with, based on the fact they're just not spending the money, which just means you're not being bold about your retirement plans and your spending. You're just being extremely cautious. But I get it. the influences outside us make us worry about these things. You're actually more likely to double your investment money in retirement by not spending it rather than actually running out. But remember this, money without a plan equals fear, but money with a purpose actually equals freedom. Now, having a blank check in retirement is actually scary, but having a guided plan and a framework is actually really empowering. Now, it's not about forcing spending in retirement. It's about putting parameters or guardrails in place to ensure that you have a plan for how you're going to spend it, allowing you to spend when the markets are good and allowing you to kind of ease back when the markets are bad. Think of it like a flexible thermostat in the house for the temperature of your room. When it gets too hot, we turn it down. When it gets too cold, we turn it up. Exactly the same was with your money in retirement. And it's also having that foresight to keep a certain amount of money in cash reserves. We usually look to keep between 12 and 2 years worth of easy accessible cash. So when the markets do turn, you're not drawing your money out in a downward spiraling market, and you can actually rely on your reserves in cash to help fill the gap until the markets recover. And it's all about having that plan to make sure that these things actually work. It's about just putting a framework in place that helps you be comfortable in retirement and make sure it relieves that fear of running out of money, because none of us want that to happen. We certainly don't. And that's why we robustly test everything with our clients using cash flow forecasting, which I'll show you a demo of towards the end of this video. Now, with a plan, that allows you to actually spend with confidence and not feel like you're gambling your money away, because you've tested the different scenarios. You've looked at what the markets could affect it. And with that plan, it just makes things that little bit easier to guide you through retirement. So actually, in reality, you don't need £1 million in retirement, which you see a lot of people talking about. You just need enough to fund your life. And that comes down to the individual needs that you have. Journalists, social media, the news, they all glorify this £1 million mark in retirement. It's a clean number. It's dramatic. That word was always bandied around about being a millionaire. So it works. It helps people get in that mindset. But actually, it can be a negative effect on you, thinking you just don't have enough. It might be actually you're trying to save to this target, which is much higher than you really need. And you're getting stuck in the rat race, stressed and worried that you're not going to have enough, putting off things when actually maybe you only need half of that amount of money. So let's look at the retirement living standards figures. Now, they say for a moderate couple retiring, on average, they're going to need $43,100 in retirement to live a moderate lifestyle. Now, let's bear in mind a couple retiring today are going to have well over 20,000, which is over half that amount of money potentially coming from state pension, which is guaranteed income. So they've only got to fill a small gap. So actually, is £1 million really needed, or is potentially $500,000 more than comfortable for a couple to retire today on a moderate expenditure? So in most people's lives, the magic number of $1 million is potentially overkill, unless you have these big desires of buying a Lamborghini when you retire, or buying a boat to sail around the Med. I don't know, whatever those might be. So things can change, but it's all individual to you. Your retirement is individualized to you. So don't chase this number that everyone else is saying you should need. You need to chase the number which is right for you. So let me show you what that looks like in a real life example. We're going to look at a couple who are retiring today, and actually by having £1 million invested along with state pensions, what that can actually look like if they don't spend enough money. Meet John and Joanne Jones. And what we're going to do, we're going to show you the scenarios of what money they would potentially have left, retiring at 67, both of them, with £500,000 each in a pension and also having a state pension. And they don't have any other investments or savings. So in this example, that's how we've structured it, just to give you an idea of what we were talking about in this video. So we're going to use the retirement living standards at the basic, moderate and comfortable level. So if we look at the first one here, so we're looking at 21,600 expenditure. Okay. So this is a cash flow forecasting system. What this is going to give us is a potential likelihood of success in retirement of not round of money. And this is based on 792 scenarios back tested against 110 years worth of history. So to give you a little bit of idea of what that means is looking at historical risk testing. Okay, so it's looking at wars, hyperinflation, pandemics, and many other major world events to say, well, actually, if all these things happened again in different variations, going forward, how would that money which these clients need to draw from their pensions, how would that fare long term with regards to run out of money, and how much would they have left at the end? Okay, so looking at the sentence here, so yes, they have £500,000 in pensions. Mr. Jones has his money in an aggressive portfolio. That's a 70-30 mix of 70% equity, 30% bonds. And then Joanne has a balanced portfolio, which is 50-50, 50% equity, 50% bonds. So let's have a look how this will kind of fare now. So income sources, just a pension. Spending, we've set at 21,600. And then what we've done when they hit 85 is we've dropped their expenditure by 20%, because as we get older, the likelihood of spending money in retirement as much as we were is going to drop. Now, all of this is inflation linked. So the system will calculate different variations of inflation over the long term. So in this instant, if they were to draw 21,600, that's what they need to live on, they were more than comfortable and they would have excess left over. So let's have a look what that looks like in a real life chart, okay? So if we looked at the median level, okay, this would mean if they continue to only spend that amount of money in retirement with a £500,000, they could die aged 100 with an excess of 6 million in their pension still, because they're just not spending their capital. And that's based on the median return. Now, you can look at different variations on here. We have, for example, the 30th percentile, which is probably a little bit more realistic, is 4.42 million left in their pension pot, okay? And even if we looked at the worst case scenario, that's where we go into a position of high inflation, high cost of living, zero growth in the economy for the rest of their lives. They would still retire or die with 1.5 million, leaving that in their estate. So this is what we talk about when we're not spending enough in retirement. Okay, so that's the example of 21,600. So let's move on to the median level, which is 43,900 expenditure. Now the system's already worked out tax and things like that, but this is purely just going to be how will this one fare. So again, we have 100% likelihood of success. Okay, of them not running out of money in retirement. Again, 792 scenarios, back tested against 110 years worth of history. Okay, exactly the same setup, but this time, what do we look at the median? So on the median here, so okay, so they're going to be left with 2.93 million potentially in there. Okay, even spending that amount of money. And then if we looked at some of the higher levels here, you know, we have what this one here is called the blue line is the best case scenario. That's where everything's rosy. That is just silly money left in there. But this is just highlighting the fact that actually, this is why we need to use things like cash flow forecasting to see what we can actually spend in retirement. Okay, so that we don't end up spending all our lives scrimping and scraping to leave a huge amount of money in investments. Okay, so there's another 90% of 7 million left in there. Okay, but even if we worked on the median case, they got nearly £3 million left over in retirement, and that's drawing 43,900 net. Okay, expenditure per month. Okay, let's look at the comfortable. This is the one where a couple retiring comfortable. The retirement living standards say comfortable retirement covers 60,000 years, £5,000 a month. Okay, now in this instance, actually, it shows as potentially unsustainable in this instance. Okay. Now, what does that actually mean? Well, if the worst case scenario happened, there is a likelihood that they would potentially run out of money. Okay. And also, even if we looked at the median, there's actually a chance that by the age of 93, they could run out of money. But if things were all rosy, again, they would kind of have a lot of money left over. So this is just an example of actually, depending on what your lifestyle requirements are, okay, and what you've got in savings will depend on actually how long your pension will last. But if you do not spend enough, there is that likelihood you're going to die with a lot of money left in investments. But then also, if you spend too much money, there is the likelihood that you could run out of money. And the only way really to test that is to run a proper financial plan and run a cash flow forecasting module. So this is based on John and Joanne Jones, 67, retiring with only state pension. And these are the different levels at the 21,600, 43,900 and 60,600. Now, if they did the moderate, like I say, they would still die with a lot of money in the bank. And this is why we insist on ensuring that people run a cash flow forecast retirement rather than trying to guess their way through retirement. Now, if you want to know what your safe number is in retirement and how much you actually need, so it's not just guesswork and a finger in the air or following what other people tell you need to do, click the link below and book a call in with me, and let's see if we can help you make a plan for your financial future so you're on track and you don't have that fear of running out of money. Now, if you like this video, please like and subscribe because it helps me share this information and knowledge with other people. If you enjoyed this video, watch the next one because this one will also help you with your retirement plans.